Welcome everyone to this 5th episode of the Computer Vision course. In today's lesson, we will continue to analyze the output of the camera, that is, the digital image. While in previous episodes we mainly focused on black and white images, or rather grayscale images, today we will start talking about color images. But before we begin, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what a digital image actually is. In previous episodes, we've seen that a digital image is nothing more than a matrix of numbers. The dimensions of this matrix correspond to the pixel dimensions on the camera sensor. So I'll have as many rows and columns as there are rows and columns of pixels in the camera sensor itself. Inside this matrix, each cell contains a number, which, in the simplest conversion, can range from 0 to 255, where 0 corresponds to a completely dark pixel, so black. 255 corresponds to a completely bright pixel, so white. In between, I'll have all the possible shades of gray. To understand how a color image is made, let's take another look at the process of converting light information into a digital image. As we saw a few episodes ago, the light emitted by a light source hits an object, is reflected by it, and enters the camera. Thanks to the sensor inside the camera, it's possible to convert this light first into electrical information, into electrons, and then into digital information, creating the actual image. Now let's try to think of light as a collection of electromagnetic waves with different frequencies, and therefore different colors. The light that hits the object will contain all these wavelengths, and if we focus only on the visible part of the light, it will generally include all the colors, from red through green and up to blue and violet. This combination of colors then strikes the object, and part of it is reflected by the object. If we imagine a completely white object, which therefore does not absorb any wavelengths, the reflected light will still contain all the wavelengths of the incident light. At this point, the reflected light enters the camera and hits the sensor, thus being converted into a digital value. From what we've seen so far, the sensor combines all the wavelengths, that is colors, that hit each pixel, thus creating a grayscale image. The colors are, in a way, lost, but maybe it would be better to say merged, at the level of the camera sensor. Now, let's imagine we have an object, something, that allows us to keep the colors separate. The light hits the object, is reflected by it, and enters the camera. At this point, it encounters the object that is able to split it into 3 main zones. One zone is around the red spectrum, one zone is around the green spectrum, and one zone is around the blue spectrum. Thanks to this trichromatic object, we have the spectrum divided into 3 areas. Within each area, the electromagnetic waves that belong to that area are combined together, creating 3 images that correspond to, or are at least very close to, the color of that area. So, an image with a strong red tint for the red area, an image with a strong green tint for the green area, and an image with a strong blue tint for the blue area. At this point, what would happen if we combine these 3 images? We would actually get the color image of the original object. This is exactly what happens inside a color camera. The spectrum is divided into 3 parts. We haven't said how yet, and 3 images are created, meaning 3 matrices with the same number of rows and columns as the sensor inside the camera. The value inside each cell of each of these matrices will correspond to the brightness value of the light hitting that particular pixel. By finally overlapping these 3 matrices, I will get the actual color image. Each cell of the matrix will contain a number that is proportional to the intensity of the light that struck that specific pixel. This number, in the simplest conversion, as in grayscale images, can range from 0 to 255, where 0 means minimum brightness and 255 means maximum brightness. The difference between color images and grayscale images lies in the fact that, in this case, brightness is not related to the entire light spectrum, but only to the area of that particular image. So, for example, only in the red area for the red image, and the same goes for the green image and the blue image. Even when considering colors, digital images are nothing more than matrices of numbers. In this case, I will have to consider 3 matrices instead of just one. With that understood, let's now take a look at the object that is able to separate the spectrum into 3 parts. The object in question is called the Bayer filter. The Bayer filter, or Bayer pattern, is essentially a filter, that is, an element that blocks or lets things pass through. In this case, the Bayer filter can block or allow certain wavelengths to pass through, and therefore colors, allowing them to actually reach the camera sensor. So, how does this Bayer filter work? The Bayer filter is made up of a grid, as large as the camera sensor itself, composed of many elements. Each element will block or let through a specific wavelength, and therefore a specific color. Some elements will let red light through, some will let green through, and some will let blue through. At this point, thanks to the control electronics inside the camera, it becomes possible to transform the light that passes through these elements into the 3 images we mentioned earlier, 1 red, 1 green, and 1 blue exactly. This process is called demosacing, and it allows us to obtain the color image starting from each of these 3 images, the red, the green, and the blue. As you can see from the animation, each cell of the spectrum is colored according to the color of the light that passes through it. By combining the information from adjacent cells, it's finally possible to reconstruct the final color information. At this point, we know how a color image is made. We can start talking about color spaces. Color spaces are therefore ways that allow us to mathematically describe every color present in the image. But let's try to better understand how these spaces work and what they're used for. Graphically, the RGB color space can be seen as a Cartesian cube where each axis represents a color. In this case, each axis can go from 0 to 255 and will represent the shade of red, the shade of green, and the shade of blue. Let's look at an example. In the RGB color space, each color is associated with a triplet of numbers. So, for example, a certain combination of numbers might represent a light blue, another combination of violet, and yet another a yellow. So, depending on which numbers I put in this triplet, I can create a different color. By changing this triplet, I also change the color. In the RGB color space, the extremes will always be represented by black and white. The color black, meaning the complete absence of all shades, will be represented by the combination 000. The color white, meaning the complete presence of all shades, will instead be represented by the maximum combination, so 255, 255, 255. This is not the only way to represent colors. Another possibility is represented by the HSL or HSV color space. In this case, each color is still represented by a triplet of numbers, where each number stands for hue, saturation, and intensity. Graphically, this color space can be visualized as a polar cylinder, where each axis is represented by one of these numbers. So, we will no longer talk about parts of red, parts of green, and parts of blue, but instead about hue, saturation, and intensity. Keep in mind that in the HSL or HSV space, each axis, that is, each value no longer ranges from 0 to 255. In this case, the H-axis, meaning hue, since it represents the angle of the polar cylinder, can range from 0 to 360. The S-axis, which is saturation and represents the radius of the polar cylinder, can range from 0 to 100%. Finally, the L or V-axis, since it represents the height of the polar cylinder, can also range from 0 to 100%. Again, each color is represented by 3 numbers. But they have a different meaning. How do we see this? From the example, in fact, the same colors we saw earlier. In the example of the scale, RGB colors can be obtained using the HSL or HSV color scale. In this case, the values are different, but the colors you get are exactly the same, a light blue, a violet, or a yellow. And just like before, the extreme values, black and white, will have different values. In this case, the only important number is the last one. If it's 0%, I'll get black. If it's 100%, I'll get white, no matter what the other values are. Different scales, meaning different mathematical representations of color, will always allow you to get all possible colors. The choice of one scale over another is completely arbitrary and is usually tied to the analysis that will be done on the final image. To sum up color spaces, in the RGB color space, each color is represented by 3 values. Colors are represented in a Cartesian space, and all the axes go from 0 to 255. If I want to change the color hue, in general I have to change all 3 values, meaning I have to move along all the axes. In the HSL or HSV color space, on the other hand, I still have 3 values for each color. In this case, though, colors are represented in a polar space. And the axes go from 0 to 360 degrees, or from 0 to 100%. To change the color hue, you only need to adjust one axis, the hue axis specifically. Just a quick historical note to wrap up. The HSL or HSV color scale was actually created thanks to this very feature, along with the first color television screens, where there was a need for an easy and quick way to change color. With the RGB color scale, this wasn't feasible because to change the color you had to adjust all 3 values. That's not the case with the HSL or HSV color scales. At this point, we've also understood how color images work. So now we're ready to move on to the next element of our vision system, optics and lenses.